The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of San Francisco International Airport as Thomas Reid checked his watch one last time. He was early, as usual. Being punctual had become second nature during his 15-year journey from college dropout to founder and CEO of Next Wave Solutions, now valued at over $3 billion. Thomas adjusted his navy blue suit jacket and walked confidently toward the priority boarding lane. His carry-on contained everything he needed for the next 3 days: the keynote speech he would deliver at the National Tech Innovation Summit in New York, his lucky tie that he wore for every major presentation, and a small framed photo of his late grandmother who had raised him in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit. "Good morning, Mr. Reid," greeted the airline staff member at the gate, recognizing him immediately. "Always good to see our Platinum Elite members. Enjoy your flight." Thomas nodded with a polite smile. After logging over 1 million miles with this airline, many of the regular staff knew him by name. He wasn't someone who demanded special treatment, but he did appreciate the small courtesies that came with his loyalty status: priority boarding, extra legroom, and most importantly, his carefully selected window seat in the first row of first class, 1A, which he always booked weeks in advance. As Thomas settled into his seat, he felt the familiar pre-presentation butterflies in his stomach. The New York conference represented a major opportunity for Next Wave. Their new data privacy platform had the potential to revolutionize how companies protected consumer information, and this was his chance to introduce it to the industry's biggest players. He pulled out his tablet and began reviewing his presentation notes one more time. The cabin around him gradually filled with other passengers. Business people tapping away on laptops, a young couple who seemed to be starting their honeymoon, and a family with twin toddlers who were mercifully seated far behind in economy. Thomas barely noticed the commotion around him as he focused on fine-tuning his key talking points. His company had started in his garage just 8 years ago and now employed over 500 people. The responsibility of their livelihoods rested on his shoulders, making each business opportunity all the more crucial. "Excuse me, sir." Thomas looked up to find a flight attendant standing beside his seat. She was middle-aged with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, removing his earbuds. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but I need to ask if you would be willing to move to another seat," she said, her voice lowered slightly. Thomas furrowed his brow. "Is there a problem with this seat?" The flight attendant glanced over her shoulder before continuing. "We have another passenger who has specifically requested this seat. There's an equally comfortable spot in row 4 that we can move you to." "I don't understand," Thomas said, pulling up his boarding pass on his phone. "I booked this specific seat months ago. I always sit in 1A when I fly this route." "Yes, I understand, and I apologize for the inconvenience," the attendant replied, though her tone suggested growing impatience. "But the other passenger has insisted that he needs this particular seat." Thomas noticed a man hovering a few feet behind the flight attendant, white-haired, wearing an expensive-looking suit, and watching the exchange with obvious interest. Something about the man's entitled expression made Thomas's stomach tighten. "May I ask why he needs this specific seat?" Thomas inquired calmly. "I have status with this airline, and I selected this seat well in advance." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. "He says he has medical reasons," she whispered, though the man in question showed no visible signs of any condition that would require a specific seat. Thomas took a deep breath, suddenly aware that several nearby passengers were watching the exchange. He had been in situations like this before, moments where he had to decide whether to stand his ground and risk being labeled as difficult or to acquiesce to unreasonable demands to avoid confrontation. He glanced at his watch. 20 minutes until takeoff. His keynote speech was scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. He couldn't afford any delays. What Thomas didn't know was that the next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his day, but potentially an entire industry's approach to customer service and bias. Thomas looked from the flight attendant to his boarding pass and back again. The growing tension in the air was almost physical. He had faced similar situations before in high-end hotels, exclusive restaurants, and corporate events, those uncomfortable moments when someone assumed he didn't belong. "I've booked this exact seat because I need to work during the flight," Thomas explained calmly, keeping his voice level. I have an important presentation tomorrow morning. The white-haired man stepped forward now, clearing his throat loudly. Look, I specifically need this seat, he said, not bothering to address Thomas directly, but speaking to the flight attendant instead. I've been flying with this airline for 20 years. I know the CEO personally. Thomas noticed how the flight attendant's demeanor changed subtly, standing straighter, her smile becoming more genuine as she turned to the other passenger. Of course, Mr. Peterson, we're trying to sort this out right away, she assured him. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken but kept his expression neutral. Years of navigating corporate America as a black executive had taught him the delicate balance of standing up for himself without being labeled as aggressive or difficult. Man, Thomas said, I don't mean to be a problem, but I selected this seat months ago. I'm a Platinum Elite member with over 1 million miles on this airline. I'd like to understand exactly why I'm being asked to move. The flight attendant's smile tightened. Sir, Mr. Peterson has medical issues that require him to be in this particular seat. Thomas glanced at Peterson, who was now checking his gold watch impatiently. No medical equipment, no visible mobility issues, not even the special boarding designation for passengers with disabilities. What sort of medical issue requires this specific seat? Thomas asked reasonably. The question hung in the air. Several nearby passengers were now openly watching the exchange. A young woman in the aisle seat across from Thomas had stopped scrolling through her phone and was observing with undisguised interest. The flight attendant lowered her voice. I'm not at liberty to discuss another passenger's medical information. I understand privacy concerns, Thomas nodded, but I'm being asked to give up a seat I specifically selected and paid for. I think I deserve a clear explanation. Peterson scoffed loudly. This is ridiculous. Are we really going to delay the entire flight over this? The comment stung. Thomas was being painted as the problem, despite being the one whose rights were being infringed upon. Sir, the flight attendant said to Thomas, her tone hardening, if you're refusing to cooperate, I'll need to call the head purser. I'm not refusing to cooperate, Thomas clarified, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest when facing these situations. I'm simply asking for a valid explanation before I give up the seat I booked. I'll get the purser, she said curtly, turning on her heel and walking toward the front of the cabin. Peterson smirked, then loudly sighed for the benefit of those around them. Some people just don't understand how things work, he muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Thomas felt a familiar heaviness settling over him. He'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing, employed hundreds of people, and was scheduled to give the keynote at one of the industry's most prestigious conferences. Yet here he was, being treated like an inconvenience. The head purser, a tall man with graying temples, approached with a stern expression. Sir, I understand there's an issue with the seating arrangement. Thomas began to explain, but Peterson interrupted. I specifically requested this seat for medical reasons, and this gentleman is refusing to accommodate me. That's not accurate, Thomas corrected calmly. I booked this seat months ago, and am simply asking for a legitimate explanation for why I'm being asked to move. The purser glanced between them, then at the growing line of passengers still boarding. Sir, he addressed Thomas, not Peterson. I'm going to have to ask you to move to seat 4C. We need to complete boarding. Is it company policy to move passengers without explanation? Thomas asked. Sir, if you continue to be difficult, we may need to have you removed from the flight. The threat hung in the air. Thomas looked around at the watching faces, some curious, some uncomfortable, a few nodding in agreement with the purser. The young woman across the aisle now had her phone held at a peculiar angle, possibly recording the interaction. Thomas had a split-second decision to make. Fight for his rights and risk missing his keynote, or swallow this indignity and make it to New York. With hundreds of employees counting on him, he knew what he had to do. Fine, he said quietly, gathering his belongings. I'll move. Thomas made his way to seat 4C with as much dignity as he could muster. The seat was in first class too, but it was an aisle seat with less legroom and closer to the galley where flight attendants would be preparing service throughout the flight. Thomas knew it would be harder to work with the constant movement and noise. As he stored his carry-on in the overhead bin, he caught snippets of whispered conversations. Did you see that? They just made him move. The other guy didn't even look sick. Always happens to. Thomas took a deep breath and settled into the seat, feeling the weight of eyes on him. The woman next to him glanced up briefly from her magazine, then returned to reading without a word. From his new seat, Thomas could see Peterson making himself comfortable in seat 1A, his seat. The man flagged down a flight attendant, not the one from earlier, but a different one, and ordered a pre-takeoff champagne with the easy confidence of someone used to getting his way. Thomas pulled out his tablet again, trying to focus on his presentation, but the words blurred before his eyes. The familiar tightness in his chest had spread to his throat now. He'd faced discrimination before: the security guard who followed him around high-end stores, the valet who assumed he was waiting for a taxi rather than bringing his car, the real estate agent who suddenly claimed properties were off the market. But something about this incident cut deeper. Perhaps it was happening in such a public space. Perhaps it was the way the airline staff, a company he'd given his loyalty to for years, had so quickly sided against him. Or perhaps it was his own decision to back down, the familiar calculation: is this battle worth the potential cost? The young woman from across the aisle in his previous seat location appeared suddenly, pausing by his seat. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "My name's Lena. I saw what happened back there, and I got some of it on video. If you want it, here's my contact info." She slipped a business card onto his tray table and continued down the aisle before he could respond. Thomas picked up the card. Lena Chen, digital content creator. Her quick thinking had given him evidence of what transpired, evidence that went beyond his word against theirs. He pocketed the card, feeling a small spark of something besides humiliation, possibility. The flight attendant who had originally asked him to move now walked by, avoiding eye contact. Thomas noticed she was much more attentive to Peterson, checking multiple times if he needed anything. The contrast was stark and unmistakable. The safety demonstration began, and Thomas tried to focus. His phone buzzed with a message from his chief operating officer: "Just confirming you're all set for tomorrow's keynote." The registration list topped 2,000 attendees. 2,000 people would be listening to him tomorrow talk about innovation and digital ethics. His company's new privacy platform stood to transform how businesses protected consumer data. What had begun in his tiny apartment had grown into something that could genuinely change the industry for the better. And yet here he was, a CEO with a billion-dollar company, being treated like he didn't deserve the same respect as other passengers. As the plane began to taxi, a man in a crisp suit from the row behind leaned forward. "I'm Robert Washington," he said in a low voice. "I'm an attorney with Callaway and Washington. What happened to you wasn't right. Here's my card too, if you want to discuss options later." Thomas nodded his thanks, taking the second business card of the flight. He wasn't sure yet what he would do with these offers of support, but they provided some comfort. Evidence that not everyone on the plane was comfortable with what they had witnessed. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air. Thomas watched San Francisco shrink below them, the city where he'd built his company from nothing, where he'd proven himself time and again. Now he had to decide what to do about this latest challenge. The drink service began, and the flight attendant who had forced him to move now stood by his seat. "What can I get you, sir?" she asked, not quite meeting his eyes. "Just water, please," Thomas replied evenly. When she handed him the plastic cup, her hand was trembling slightly. Perhaps she knew she'd made a mistake. Perhaps she was just uncomfortable. Either way, it was clear she recognized that something wrong had happened. Thomas sipped his water and made a decision. He wouldn't let this incident pass unnoted. Not with a public shaming campaign or an angry social media post, but something more strategic, something that might actually create lasting change. He pulled out his phone and began typing an email addressed to the airline's CEO. Direct, professional, and backed by evidence thanks to Lena, it would be waiting in the CEO's inbox when they landed in New York. This story was far from over. The plane touched down at JFK with a gentle bump. Thomas had spent most of the 5-hour flight working on his presentation, or at least trying to. His mind kept drifting back to what had happened during boarding. Each time he glanced toward the front of the cabin and saw Peterson enjoying the seat that should have been his, the memory stung freshly. As passengers stood to retrieve their bags, Thomas noticed Lena, the young woman who had recorded the incident giving him a small nod. Behind him, Robert the attorney was speaking quietly on his phone. Thomas realized that his private humiliation had been witnessed by an entire section of the plane, and the weight of those eyes on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, added to his discomfort. The flight attendant who had forced him to move was now standing near the exit, thanking passengers as they deplaned. When Thomas approached, she looked away, suddenly busy with paperwork. He passed without comment, his silence more powerful than any words. In the terminal, he was surprised to find Lena waiting for him. "Mr. Reed, I wasn't sure if you wanted this right away," she said, holding up her phone. "I can send you the video now if you give me your email." "Thank you," Thomas replied, genuinely moved by her thoughtfulness. "I appreciate you taking the initiative to record that." Lena shrugged. "My mom taught me to document everything. She came to this country 30 years ago and learned the hard way that sometimes your word isn't enough." She looked down at her phone. "Plus, I have over 2 million followers on social media. If you want this to get attention, I can help." Thomas considered her offer carefully. Going viral might bring quick satisfaction, but was it the most effective approach? Before he could respond, Robert Washington appeared at his side. "Mr. Reed, I hope you don't mind me introducing myself again," the attorney said. "What I witnessed on that plane was textbook discrimination. The airline violated its own policies, not to mention possibly breaking federal law." Thomas looked between these two strangers who had stepped forward to help him, Lena with her digital reach and Robert with his legal expertise. They represented two possible paths forward. "I appreciate both your offers," Thomas said, "but I want to be strategic about this. Before I decide anything, I'd like to see the video." The three of them moved to a quiet corner of the terminal. Lena pulled up the recording and handed Thomas her phone. The footage was even clearer than he had anticipated, capturing the flight attendant's dismissive tone, Peterson's entitled behavior, and the purser's threat to remove Thomas from the flight. Most damning was the lack of any visible reason why Peterson would need that specific seat for medical purposes. "This is very compelling evidence," Robert said quietly. "With this and your status as a high-tier frequent flyer, we could build a strong case. My firm handles discrimination suits against major corporations, and we win." Thomas nodded, still watching the video as Lena forwarded it to his email address. "What would winning look like to you, Robert?" "Financial settlement, certainly. Possibly policy changes, though those are harder to enforce. Public apology," Robert listed. "We could make them pay, literally and figuratively." Thomas slipped his phone back into his pocket, thinking about what really mattered to him. Money wasn't an issue. His company had made him wealthy beyond what he had ever imagined growing up. Public humiliation of the airline might feel satisfying in the moment, but would it create lasting change? "I have a different approach in mind," Thomas said finally. "But I may need help from both of you." His phone buzzed with a hotel confirmation. He needed to check in and prepare for tomorrow's keynote. But now, alongside his presentation preparations, he had another project to work on. "I'm going to contact the airline's executive office directly," he explained. "With this video as evidence, I want to propose something that could transform how they operate, not just extract an apology or settlement." Lena looked intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "Something more impactful than a viral moment or a lawsuit," Thomas replied. "But first, I need to make it impossible for them to ignore me." He opened his email app and began composing a message addressed to the airline's chief executive officer. The subject line read, "Platinum Elite member removed from Seat 1A, an opportunity for systemic change." "Most people would be looking for revenge," Robert observed, watching Thomas type. "You're thinking bigger than that." Thomas nodded. "In my business, I've learned that true change doesn't come from public shaming or even legal penalties. It comes from showing companies a better way forward, one that aligns their interests with doing the right thing." As he crafted the email, attaching the video with Lena's permission, Thomas felt his focus shifting from the humiliation he had experienced to the possibility of turning this incident into something meaningful. By the time he hit send, the knot of anger in his chest had loosened, replaced by a sense of purpose that felt far more powerful. "Now we wait," he said, looking at his watch. I expect we'll hear back before my keynote tomorrow morning. Thomas woke up at 5:30 a.m. in his hotel room, his body still on San Francisco time. The keynote speech was just 3 hours away, but his mind wasn't on his presentation. He reached for his phone, checking for a response from the airline. Nothing yet. After a quick shower, he reviewed his presentation one last time, making small adjustments to his talking points. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, not an email, but a text from Lena. The video got leaked somehow. Already 50K views and climbing. I swear it wasn't me. Thomas felt a jolt of surprise. He quickly opened the link she sent. There it was, the confrontation on the plane, already gaining comments and shares by the minute. The airline was tagged in thousands of posts, with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #AirlineDiscrimination trending. This wasn't part of his plan. He'd wanted to approach the situation privately first, to give the airline a chance to respond before public pressure forced their hand. Now that choice had been taken from him. His phone rang, an unknown number. Mr. Reed? This is Patricia Wilson, Executive Assistant to Gregory Daniels, CEO of Atlantic Airways. Thomas sat up straighter. Yes, speaking. Mr. Daniels has asked me to connect you immediately. Are you available to talk? Less than 30 seconds later, the airline CEO was on the line. Mr. Reed, Greg Daniels here. First, let me say how deeply troubled I am by what I've seen in that video. This is not how Atlantic Airways treats our valued customers, especially our Platinum Elite members. The CEO sounded genuinely disturbed, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had likely been awake all night dealing with a rapidly escalating PR crisis. I appreciate you reaching out, Thomas replied evenly. Your email mentioned you had ideas about systemic changes rather than just addressing your individual situation. I'm very interested in hearing more about that, Daniels continued. Would you be willing to meet in person? I can have my jet at JFK within 3 hours. Thomas glanced at his watch. I have a keynote address at the National Tech Innovation Summit this morning. I could meet you afterward around noon. We'll work around your schedule, Mr. Reed. And of course, we'll be upgrading you to our highest tier of service permanently, along with compensation for your experience. Thomas hadn't mentioned compensation in his email. The CEO was clearly trying to get ahead of both the legal and public relations aspects of the situation. Mr. Daniels, to be clear, I'm not interested in special treatment or financial settlement. What happened to me happens to people who don't have my resources or platform every day. That's what I want to address. There was a pause on the line. I understand, Daniels finally said, sounding both surprised and relieved. In that case, I'm even more interested in hearing your thoughts. I'll be there at noon. When Thomas arrived at the conference center an hour later, he was surprised to find a small crowd of reporters waiting. News of the video had spread quickly, and his name had been identified by internet sleuths overnight. Mr. Reed, can you comment on what happened on your flight yesterday? Are you planning to sue Atlantic Airways? Do you think this incident represents a pattern at the airline? Thomas raised his hands calmly. I have a keynote to deliver right now. Afterward, I'll have more to say about the situation. As he made his way to the stage, his phone buzzed again. Robert, the attorney, had sent a message. Media is going wild with this. My firm can issue a statement on your behalf. At least 5 major news networks want interviews. Thomas woke up at 5:30 a.m. in his hotel room, his body still on San Francisco time. The keynote speech was just 3 hours away, but his mind wasn't on his presentation. He reached for his phone, checking for a response from the airline. Nothing yet. After a quick shower, he reviewed his presentation one last time, making small adjustments to his talking points. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, not an email, but a text from Lena. The video got leaked somehow. Already 50K views and climbing. I swear it wasn't me. Thomas felt a jolt of surprise. He quickly opened the link she sent. There it was, the confrontation on the plane, already gaining comments and shares by the minute. The airline was tagged in thousands of posts, with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #AirlineDiscrimination trending. This wasn't part of his plan. He'd wanted to approach the situation privately first, to give the airline a chance to respond before public pressure forced their hand. Now that choice had been taken from him. His phone rang, an unknown number. "Mr. Reed, this is Patricia Wilson, Executive Assistant to Gregory Daniels, CEO of Atlantic Airways." Thomas sat up straighter. "Yes, speaking. Mr. Daniels has asked me to connect you immediately. Are you available to talk?" Less than 30 seconds later, the airline CEO was on the line. "Mr. Reed, Greg Daniels here. First, let me say how deeply troubled I am by what I've seen in that video. This is not how Atlantic Airways treats our valued customers, especially our Platinum Elite members." The CEO sounded genuinely disturbed, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had likely been awake all night dealing with a rapidly escalating PR crisis. "I appreciate you reaching out," Thomas replied evenly. "Your email mentioned you had ideas about systemic changes rather than just addressing your individual situation. I'm very interested in hearing more about that," Daniels continued. "Would you be willing to meet in person? I can have my jet at JFK within 3 hours." Thomas glanced at his watch. "I have a keynote address at the National Tech Innovation Summit this morning. I could meet you afterward around noon." "We'll work around your schedule, Mr. Reed. And of course, we'll be upgrading you to our highest tier of service permanently, along with compensation for your experience." Thomas hadn't mentioned compensation in his email. The CEO was clearly trying to get ahead of both the legal and public relations aspects of the situation. "Mr. Daniels, to be clear, I'm not interested in special treatment or financial settlement. What happened to me happens to people who don't have my resources or platform every day. That's what I want to address." There was a pause on the line. "I understand," Daniels finally said, sounding both surprised and relieved. "In that case, I'm even more interested in hearing your thoughts. I'll be there at noon." When Thomas arrived at the conference center an hour later, he was surprised to find a small crowd of reporters waiting. News of the video had spread quickly, and his name had been identified by internet sleuths overnight. "Mr. Reed, can you comment on what happened on your flight yesterday? Are you planning to sue Atlantic Airways? Do you think this incident represents a pattern at the airline?" Thomas raised his hands calmly. "I have a keynote to deliver right now. Afterward, I'll have more to say about the situation." As he made his way to the stage, his phone buzzed again. Robert, the attorney, had sent a message. "Media is going wild with this. My firm can issue a statement on your behalf. At least 5 major news networks want interviews." The private dining room at the top of the Meridian Hotel offered a stunning view of Central Park, but neither Thomas nor the 3 Atlantic Airways executives seated across from him were paying attention to the scenery. The atmosphere was tense, with nervous glances exchanged between the airline representatives. Gregory Daniels, the airline CEO, sat directly across from Thomas. Beside him were Valerie Thompson, the head of customer experience, and David Chen, their chief diversity officer, a position Thomas suspected might have been hastily filled that very morning. "Again, Mr. Reed, let me express our deepest apologies for what happened," Daniels began, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "We've already suspended the flight attendant and purser pending a full investigation." Thomas shook his head. "That's not what I want. Punishing individual employees doesn't fix the underlying problem." The executives exchanged surprised glances. "You're not calling for their termination?" Thompson asked. "No. They were following unwritten rules that exist throughout your company, and frankly, throughout our society," Thomas replied. "Firing them might make you feel better, but it won't prevent this from happening to someone else next week or next month." Thomas opened his laptop and turned it around so they could see the screen. "Since the video went viral this morning, my team has collected over 300 similar stories from your passengers. Black customers, Asian customers, Middle Eastern customers, all describing variations of what happened to me." Chen, the diversity officer, leaned forward with a pained expression. "We have mandatory diversity training for all staff, 4 hours every year." Thomas couldn't help but smile slightly. 4 hours of watching outdated videos isn't going to override deeply ingrained biases. You need something more substantial, more engaging, and more effective. "What exactly are you proposing?" Daniels asked, his earlier defensiveness now replaced with genuine curiosity. Thomas took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been preparing for since sending that first email. A partnership. My company specializes in advanced AI and simulation technology. What if we developed a training program specifically for your staff that uses immersive scenarios and real-time feedback? He pulled up a presentation on his laptop, slides he had created late last night in his hotel room while most CEOs would have been consulting with their lawyers. We can create a virtual reality training program that puts your employees in the shoes of passengers from different backgrounds. They'll experience what it feels like to be treated differently based on how they look. We'll combine that with data analysis of your current customer service patterns to identify problem areas. The airline executives leaned forward, their interest clearly piqued. Instead of just telling people not to discriminate, we'll help them understand why certain behaviors are problematic and give them practical tools to do better, Thomas continued. And it won't just be about race. We'll address ageism, ableism, all forms of bias that might affect your passengers. Daniels looked thoughtful. This sounds innovative, but also expensive. Thomas nodded. It will require investment, yes, but consider the cost of not doing it. Your stock dropped 3% this morning. The hashtag boycott Atlantic Airways has been used over 50,000 times today. How much is that costing you? The room fell silent as the executives absorbed his words. As for my personal situation, Thomas continued, I don't want financial compensation. Instead, I want you to commit to implementing this program company-wide, and I want to be involved in its development to ensure it's done right. Thompson looked skeptical. You're willing to work with us? After how we treated you? This isn't about me, Thomas said simply. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. And frankly, it's also good business. Customers who feel respected keep coming back. Daniels studied Thomas for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Mr. Reed, I came here prepared to offer you money to make this problem go away. You're offering us something much more valuable, a way to be better. There's one more thing, Thomas added. I want to meet with the flight attendant and purser who were involved. Not to berate them, but to include their perspective in developing the training. They need to be part of the solution. Chen looked impressed. That's unusually gracious. Thomas shrugged. It's practical. They know firsthand where the system failed. And they'll be powerful advocates for change if they're included rather than just punished. Daniels extended his hand across the table. Mr. Reed, we have a deal. When can your team start? My chief technology officer is already assembling a development team. We can begin next week. As they shook hands, Thomas's phone buzzed with a news alert. Atlantic Airways CEO and Next Wave CEO in private meeting. Settlement expected. Thomas smiled. The media had it all wrong. This wasn't about a settlement. It was about the beginning of something much more important. One last thing, Thomas said. I want this to be public. No NDAs, no confidentiality clauses. I want other companies to see what we're doing and follow suit. Daniels hesitated only briefly before nodding. Agreed. Transparency will show we're serious about change. As the meeting concluded and they walked toward the elevators, Daniels asked quietly, What made you take this approach? Most people would have just sued us. Thomas thought about it for a moment. My grandmother used to say that when you find yourself in a hole, you have two options. You can dig deeper or you can build a ladder. I've always tried to build ladders. 6 months later, Thomas stood in a large training room at Atlantic Airways headquarters. The space was filled with 30 flight attendants and customer service representatives wearing virtual reality headsets. As he walked between them, he could hear snippets of their reactions. I didn't realize how that would come across. Oh wow, I think I've done that before without thinking about it. That feels awful to experience. Thomas smiled as he watched them moving through the virtual scenarios his team had developed. On the wall-mounted screens, he could see what they were experiencing. Simulations that put them in the shoes of passengers from various backgrounds facing subtle and not so subtle discrimination during air travel. Grace Howard, the flight attendant who had asked Thomas to give up his seat half a year ago, removed her headset, her eyes slightly red. That was powerful, she said quietly as Thomas approached. I never thought about how my actions might feel from the other side. In the months since the incident, Grace had become one of the program's most passionate advocates. After her initial shock and shame when the video went viral, she had accepted Thomas's unexpected invitation to help develop the training. Her insights from 15 years of customer service had proved invaluable. The scenario with the seat reassignment was the hardest for me to help create, she admitted. But I think it's the most effective one. Thomas nodded. Sometimes the most painful lessons are the most important ones. The door opened and CEO Gregory Daniels entered with a group of people in business attire, executives from 3 other major airlines who had come to observe the training program. As you can see, Daniels was saying, the results have been remarkable. Customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers are up 28%. Complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped by over 60%, and employee retention has improved too. What had begun as damage control for a PR crisis had evolved into something the airline now proudly showcased. The Next Wave Atlantic Airways partnership had attracted attention throughout the industry and beyond. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. CNN confirmed for tomorrow. The Wall Street Journal piece just went live. The media interest hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown as the program showed measurable results. Thomas had given interviews to business publications, appeared on technology panels, and even delivered a TED talk about turning personal discrimination into systemic improvement. As the training session ended, Thomas gathered with the participants for a debrief. This was his favorite part, hearing how people's perspectives had shifted after experiencing bias from the receiving end. Before today, I thought I treated everyone the same, one veteran flight attendant said. Now I realize I was making assumptions about passengers based on how they look or dress. I didn't even know I was doing it. Another added, the scenario where I experienced being ignored while a white passenger got immediate attention, that hit home. I've probably done that myself without realizing it. Thomas nodded. Awareness is the first step. Now you have tools to catch yourself before those biases affect how you treat people. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat in Daniel's office, reviewing the data from the first 6 months of the program. The results speak for themselves, Daniels said, sliding a report across the desk. The training has been so successful that our board has approved expanding it to all operational areas, not just customer-facing roles. Thomas scanned the numbers with satisfaction, and the other airlines. All 4 major competitors have signed contracts with Next Wave to develop similar programs, Daniels confirmed. You've started something that's spreading throughout the industry. As they talked, Daniel's assistant knocked and entered. Sir, there's something you should see. She turned on the office television to a breaking news story. On screen was Oliver Peterson, the white passenger who had taken Thomas's seat that day. He was being escorted from another flight, looking considerably less dignified than the last time Thomas had seen him. The news anchor explained, the passenger, identified as Oliver Peterson, was removed from a flight today after allegedly demanding that another passenger give up their seat to him. Airline representatives state that their new zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior was implemented after a high-profile incident last year. Thomas and Daniels exchanged a look, but neither commented on the irony. After leaving the airline headquarters, Thomas called his grandmother, the woman who had raised him with the wisdom to build ladders instead of digging holes. The program's expanding to other airlines, Gran, he told her. What started as something awful has turned into real change. That's because you saw the bigger picture, she replied. Some people want revenge, but you wanted improvement. That's always been your strength. As Thomas headed to the airport for his flight home, where he would indeed be sitting in seat 1A, he reflected on how far things had come. One humiliating experience, handled with strategic thinking rather than anger, had created ripples that were now changing an entire industry. The final irony wasn't lost on him. If Peterson hadn't taken his seat that day, none of this positive change would have happened. Sometimes, Thomas thought, the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, if you're willing to build something constructive from them.